Hi, and welcome to Music Appreciation, Week 6. Let's do a quick review from last week. I've been talking about the orchestral percussion section, and we were looking at 3 different classifications of percussion. Do you remember the 3 classifications of percussion I used? I'll give you a hint. The first one was pitched percussion, and that was for instruments that make actual sounds and notes like marimba, glockenspiel, and tubular bells. What was the second classification? The second was unpitched percussion, where all the drums and the sound effects go. And the third? Timpani. They got their own classification because they're a special case. In the pitched percussion department, you got to hear a handbell choir. You heard a flexotone that normally gets used as a sound effect, but someone played Happy Birthday on it just to be weird. Moving into unpitched percussion, I talked about the snare drum and how it got really its boost from its use in the military. It was used to keep the troops in step so they wouldn't trip on each other while they were marching. Drums were also used to signal commands to troops, like when to get up, when to eat, when to go to sleep, as well as transmitting battlefield commands. Then I talked a little about how the modern drum set came about. It was actually shrinking budgets that got theaters to try to make the most of each musician. In this case, they wanted one player to play several drums. So drummers started bringing all sorts of contraptions to the gig to help them to play multiple instruments at once. The bass drum pedal gave the foot something to do, and it freed up a drummer's hands to be able to play everything else. The word contraption was gradually shortened to trap, and nowadays a popular drummer plays a trap set from the word contraption. From the trap set back to orchestral percussion, I finished up my overview of the unpitched percussion instruments. Maracas, tambourine, even the brake drum is used in an orchestra. Then it was on to the final main instrument in the percussion section, the timpani. Remember, timpani is the plural form of the word. Do you remember what one timpani drum is called? One drum is called a timpano. Timpanists sometimes have to tune their drums in the middle of a piece. They have a tuning gauge they can use to help, but they still have to be able to very quietly tune their drums during a piece. Then I moved on to the keyboard section. For our purposes, a keyboard section instrument is anything that has black and white keys arranged like that. So we started with the piano. The word piano is actually a shortened version of the original name, which was fortepiano, which is Italian for loud, soft. It was invented by Bartolomeo Cristofori around 1700. With the harpsichord, which was popular at the time, you couldn't change the volume of the instrument. The piano was a solution to this limitation of the harpsichord. It hammered the strings instead of plucking them like the harpsichord. This hammering mechanism in the piano is amazing. So I took a moment to show you how it works. And I hope that you have a greater appreciation for the inventiveness of the piano. Review is over. Moving on. One interesting side note, however, the action of a grand piano containing the keys and the hammers, etc., is constructed on a board, and it can be slid out of the instrument like a drawer. So when the piano technician wants to adjust or repair the action on your grand piano, she comes in, slides the action out of the instrument, and takes it home with her to work on. Take a look at this for a moment. One thing the piano offered over the harpsichord was longer sustained notes. Another was dynamic range between loud and soft. After a while, it could play louder than the harpsichord. Back in the 18th century, instruments just weren't as loud as their counterparts today. Music wasn't generally something that was performed outside or in stadiums. It was performed and heard inside, in salons, living rooms, and such. Smaller, quieter instruments fit the venues. Over the years, composers gradually wanted more volume from the instruments, and concert venues got larger, so the instruments were designed for more volume. Such is the case for the piano. Originally, pianos were made of wood, so the strings couldn't be pulled as tight or they'd break the frame of the instrument. Tighter and thicker strings equals more sound. So one of the big innovations in piano manufacturing was an iron frame to handle that increased string tension. The first pianos had tiny little hammers, even smaller than the one on the left. And even though they were comparatively louder than harpsichord, these pianos weren't capable of the volume of a contemporary piano. Over the years, the size of the hammers increased, as you can see in the center hammer and hammer on the right. These pictures aren't necessarily to scale, and the old hammer on the left was the result of 100 years of evolution already. The first Cristofori piano hammer was even smaller than that. Only 3 Cristofori-made pianos still exist. Here's one of them. If you're familiar with pianos in general, you'll notice that this piano has about half the keys of a modern piano. As a composer, you'd have to take that into account and not write really high or really low notes. It would force you to be creative when you composed. While 3 Cristofori-made pianos still exist, they aren't playable anymore. Several people have made copies, however, and here's a recording of one, so you can get the general idea of its sound. I'd like you to listen to the tone quality, timbre. It sounds lighter than a piano today. All right, that was an old piano. Half the keys, much less volume, less string tension than a modern piano. But it was and is a wonderful invention. Lots more to say about the piano, lots to know. One particularly weird way the instrument was used occurred in the 20th century. A composer named John Cage was commissioned to write music for a dance production. He wrote the entire score for a group of percussionists and showed up at the venue for the first rehearsal. There was absolutely no room for the percussionists or their instruments at the theater, just a grand piano. And as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. So he proceeded to open up the piano and put all sorts of things in, around, and through the strings to simulate all the percussion instruments he'd written for. Different things for different notes. You'd press down one key and you might get a thud sound. You'd press down a key next to it and you might get a splashy sound. You push down the key next to that and you might get something completely different. This is known as prepared piano for obvious reasons. Here are a couple of pictures of a prepared piano. You can see the screws, the bolts, washers, etc. in between the strings. It looks like a 5-year-old has had a field day inside the Steinway. And I know what that was like because my mother owned a grand piano, and my brothers and I did unforgivable things to that poor instrument. Pieces written for prepared piano would include a page which would tell you in excruciating detail how exactly to set up the preparations. Things like the note, the distance from the damper, what kind of material, like a screw or a washer, exactly which strings to touch, it would all be spelled out. To be able to replicate the performance, you'd have to replicate the preparations in the piano correctly, or the piece would sound totally different than intended. And I mean totally different. Putting a preparation in the wrong place would be tantamount to handing the cymbal player the snare part, or handing the bass player the triangle part. The music school I went to had one grand piano that was dedicated to playing just prepared piano pieces. The department was understandably queasy about people sticking hardware in all their pianos, but at the same time didn't want to stunt their creativity. So they sacrificed one piano that would get all the attention. All the other pianos were off limits for prepared piano pieces. Now, I'm going to play a clip of prepared piano. And I think it's important to set this up properly so you can appreciate it for what it is. This isn't going to sound like a Beethoven piano concerto. It's best if you listen to it as an extremely clever approximation of an entire percussion ensemble by a single musician on a piano. Here we go. Now, I realize you're not going to be humming a melody from that for the rest of the day, but for me at least, it's a very catchy rhythm. Over the years, the piano has gone through gradual changes, gradually larger hammers, and an iron frame, as I mentioned before. Also, keys for lower and higher notes. Although 88 keys is standard for a piano now, some manufacturers also make pianos with extra notes at the top and or the bottom. This one here has the extra keys black instead of white. Why? Well, you really count on your peripheral vision as a pianist, and when you're used to seeing a particular number of keys on the keyboard, it throws off your spatial perception to have more white keys on the bottom. So the manufacturer colors them black for better visual cueing. Some piano manufacturers include a little black cover instead that folds over the keys so you won't see them. And since these extra notes on pianos are rare, rarely does anyone write for them. Why bother to include them at all? Except for improvisation, what good are those extra notes to me as a pianist? I didn't know this until recently. but according to Wikipedia online, the extra keys are also added for increased resonance from the associated strings. That is, they vibrate sympathetically with other strings whenever the damper pedal is depressed, and thus it gives a fuller tone to all the notes on the piano. I hate to harp on it, but it comes down to timbre once more. Let's learn a little about some famous pianists while we're at it. I play a little piano myself, but I'm nothing more than a prancing monkey compared to these people. Clara Haskell was famous for her interpretations of Mozart. She was Romanian and graduated at age 15 from the Paris Conservatory in piano, violin, and cello. As she was touring Europe after graduating, she was placed in a plaster cast due to the advancement of scoliosis. A couple years after that, she started encountering severe stage fright that kept her from making a good living from performing. After World War II, she started to earn critical acclaim and played as a chamber musician and soloist. Here's a bit of her playing some Mozart. Clara Haskell. Another famous pianist was Franz Liszt. He played his first concert at age 9 and toured Europe from Spain to Russia in his late 20s. He was a true superstar of his day. Women tried to get strips of his clothes or locks of his hair. Fans would take piano strings he'd broken while playing and make them into bracelets. They'd acquire his cigarette butts and put leftover dregs of his tea into perfume bottles. Interestingly, he retired as a concert musician at 35 so he could concentrate on composing instead. And then he had a career in composition. Lots was made of his hands, which were rather slender. Plaster casts were made of them. Some people have maintained he could reach extremely wide intervals on piano, partially due to the webbing between his fingers being less prominent than normal. The webbing limits the amount you can spread out your hand from tip of the thumb to the pinky finger, but others disagree with that explanation. Liszt also taught many piano students, but he interestingly didn't charge for lessons. He seemed to believe that charging for lessons would conflict with the purity of the art. Many consider him to be the finest pianist of all time. Another very interesting pianist is Glenn Gould. Glenn Gould was particularly known as an interpreter of Bach. He was extremely technically proficient, but he had various eccentricities as well. He tended to hum or sing while he was playing, which frustrated studio engineers who only wanted to record the sounds of the piano. He wanted an exact playing temperature. The piano, his seating position, all had to be at an exact certain height. And he would only play concerts sitting in a particular chair his father had made. And I'm sure you'll find this easy to believe, but he was known for canceling performances at the last minute. One of his performances is included on the famous Golden Record flying through space inside Voyager 1. Let's take a little look and listen to Glenn Gould. Watch how he conducts himself with his left hand while he plays with the right hand. Also, you'll be able to see his infamous chair, which he brought with him, of course. And if you've watched other pianists, you might notice that he's sitting pretty low relative to the piano. This was just a few famous pianists. Time to introduce the organ, another keyboard instrument. There are pipe organs, reed organs, electronic organs, and we'll take a look at them all. Starting with pipe organs. You've probably heard them before and probably seen one being played, but there's a lot behind the scenes to appreciate about the beloved pipe organ. First, let's take a look at the console. That's the thing that has the keys on it. This organ here has 4 separate keyboards called manuals. Having more than one manual is helpful because the organist can set up different sounds on each manual and get different sounds quickly by switching manuals. All the little white knobs to the left and to the right of the manuals are called stops. Each one of those knobs turns air on or off to a different group of pipes. This is where we get the phrase, pull out all the stops. Pulling out all the stops, in this case, turns on all the pipes and gives you the biggest sound. How do you get higher and lower volume on a pipe organ, you might ask? If you said, turn the air pressure down, it would only make sense. Air is what makes the pipes speak. Alas, it isn't that easy. If you turn down the volume of air, the pipes play flatter. One of the things that have to be scrupulously regulated with pipe organs is consistent air pressure to the pipes. So instead, the pipes are put into sealed chests or rooms, and there's a system of airtight shutters that look like vertical blinds that can be triggered from the foot pedals on the console. It's like a gas pedal on a car, except it makes the sound louder instead. Here's what those shutters look like. Pipe organs have electric blowers that compress air and feed that air through ducting to reservoirs that store and regulate the air pressure. When the organist plays a key on the keyboard, it sends an electrical signal to open a valve on the appropriate pipe, and the note sounds. Do you see those silver knobs on the bottom by the pedals? That's down where the organist plays the pedal board with her feet. We'll get to that in a moment. But those silver knobs are foot-operated buttons that can be programmed by the organist to set a whole bunch of stops to get a desired sound. They're called pistons. There are more of them between the manuals. Do you see the little round white knobs there? They're placed there for easy access. And then there's the pedal board. The pedal board is a replica of a piano keyboard that's played instead with the feet. This adds a whole new dimension of complexity to playing the organ. You play with both feet, with your toe, with your heel, and you're playing the organ with your hands at the same time. It's absolutely crazy. My own mother was a pianist and a church organist. I've spent most Sundays as a child sitting on the organ bench beside my mother as I watched her play. I didn't think much about it at the time, but I did think it was cool to watch her play. I didn't even think about how different playing the organ was from the piano until I was an adult. Basically, you play bass lines with your feet and you play everything else with your hands. Now, you can take a fabulous pianist and put him at an organ, and he'll be able to play with his hands just fine. But the pedals, that's something you have to learn to do. I have a clip here of an organist playing The Flight of the Bumblebee on the pedal board. It's just insane. Here it is. Isn't that just crazy? Now, like most people who are really good at what they do, she makes it look incredibly easy. After watching that, I actually spent a moment thinking I might just be able to do that if I practiced for a few minutes. Then I woke up from my dream. Pipe organs have some unique problems, like ciphers. A cipher is when a single pipe gets stuck on or off. You can imagine how devastating a cipher could be to any performance. Sometimes you can get it unstuck by repeatedly playing the offending note, but sometimes it just won't be unstuck. Then you have to turn off that entire stop to make it go away. That's bad enough, but imagine trying to do this with a hand without missing a beat while you're already using both hands to play. Well, that's all I've got for this week. Next time, I'll tell you about a couple pipe organ artists and plenty of other stuff. Have a great week. Bye-bye for now.